Hi guys, so appeasement hasn't worked. Now, some weeks ago, the Prime Minister Keir Starmer travelled to Washington to meet with Trump with the hope of achieving two things. First, an improvement in the European security situation, and second, to protect the UK from any economic sanctions the US was going to impose on world trade. Well, we got the news on Wednesday that the UK would be part of a wider tariffs regime on steel and aluminium, something the government had hoped to avoid. While the EU has responded in kind, the UK government's approach seems to be more appeasement.
It's disappointing that the US has imposed these tariffs on steel and aluminium. We're champions of free and open trade, but our response to this is a pragmatic one, and it's to continue negotiating rapidly for an economic agreement with the US with the potential to eliminate additional tariffs, because we know that's in the best interest of UK businesses, and that's the kind of cool-headed, pragmatic approach that we're going to continue, where we engage closely and productively with the US.
It's quite a contrasting response to that of the EU. Ursula von der Leyen saying, quote, the EU must act to protect consumers and businesses, and has gone on to impose tariffs in response of a value of up to 26 billion euros to match the value of their exports in this area to the US. So a purposefully conciliatory approach? Could some people call it a weak response?
Well, we're in a very different position than the EU. As a result of the Prime Minister's trip to Washington last month, the UK, the UK and the US have been negotiating rapidly for an economic agreement. And so we're in a position where that negotiation is ongoing, and these global tariffs, if you like, have landed in the middle of that work. So we don't want to be pushed off course by this. We want to carry on with our rapid negotiation toward an economic agreement, because we think that that's in the best interest of British businesses and the British public, to try and get that economic deal with the US to support British businesses and their trade with the US.
I get that. It's almost sort of even more surprising, given the supposed warmth between both sides, given the goal of a free trade deal, and given the lack of a significant surplus between the two countries, that these tariffs have been imposed on the UK. I guess I come back to the big picture point that bullies respond to strength. We're not responding with strength.
Well, look, I think it's important to recognise that these tariffs are global tariffs, which have landed in the middle of our negotiations, as it were. So the negotiations that we're having with the US toward an economic agreement have been ongoing following the Prime Minister's successful trip to Washington last month. These global tariffs have landed in the middle of that process, but we think the right response is to continue pragmatically, cool-headedly, without a knee-jerk response, but toward our economic agreement that we're negotiating with the US to secure, because that's in the best interests of the UK.
Okay, this is the typical political response. What we're doing is we're approaching this with a cool head. We want to have a good trade deal with the United States and stuff like this. I'll get to the trade deal in a moment. But the reality is they couldn't be bothered, because it's not really worth it. What am I talking about? The amount of trade when it comes to steel, for example, between the UK and the US is worth about £400 million, which is a drop in the ocean compared to the whole sum of trade. For example, the EU is responding because the EU sells about 10 times more in value of steel to the US. So the UK 400 million, the EU about 3 billion. So we're talking about a huge difference here, and this is why the EU is responding in a different way. The minister could have said, well, because we don't trade so much in steel with the US, the EU trades much more. That's why the EU is responding in this way. But he didn't want to say that for political reasons. Now, where does most of the UK's trade with the US come from? Well, it comes from services. So, for example, business and management consulting, financial services, for example, from the City of London, technology and IT services, legal and accounting services, the creative industries, of course, are really important. So most of the UK's trade is in services, and Trump is imposing tariffs on goods. So the UK is, in a sense, is protected from these tariffs. Now, when it comes to a trade deal, we know a trade deal would be a disaster for two main reasons. First of all, Donald Trump is extremely unreliable, unpredictable. So you could sign a trade deal with him and the very next day he would tear it up. The second is a trade deal would be bad for the UK because the United States would extract significant concessions in any trade agreement. So, for example, the NHS, importation of hormone-treated beef and stuff like that. So, the UK would be in a bad position to do a trade deal with the US anyway. And second, if you did do a trade deal with the US, it's likely that Donald Trump would tear it up a year or 2 years after. So it wouldn't be worth the paper it's written on. But back to the tariffs, the UK is in once again, it's sort of protected. Now, the minister can't come out and say, look, we can't be bothered protecting UK steel because it represents so little, because, well, you know, people's jobs are on the line. And people's jobs are going to be on the line here. This is going to drive up the cost of UK steel. Once again, it's not a huge industry when it comes to exportation to the US, but it will make the steel more expensive. It will make it more difficult to sell that steel into the US, and then some jobs are going to be lost. But the politicians can't say that. They have to present the idea that they're meeting with Trump, that they're trying to negotiate something, but I don't really see any exemption for the UK here. Which begs the question, what was the point in going to the US to pander to Trump in the first place? It shows that you need to stand up to bullies, not appease them. Let me know in the comment section, guys, what you think. As always, your comments are greatly appreciated. Thanks a lot.